This billionaire gave 4 women black credit cards. You won't believe their choices. Oliver Grant did it because he could. He did it because he grew up with more questions than answers about what money really does to people. He did it secretly, as a test, and in an unguarded moment as a kind of confession. He wanted to know whether the same unlimited power that had insulated him from the world could also reveal the world's true colors. The penthouse was all glass and steel, a carved-out silence above the city that smelled faintly of lemon polish and leather. Oliver stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking down at a skyline he had helped shape, and for once the view did not make him feel bigger. It made him feel oddly exposed. James, his assistant for nearly 7 years, watched him with the calm patience of someone who had seen Oliver's ideas burn bright and then fizzle just as often. "You sure you want to do this?" James asked. He held the small black leather box like a prop in a play. Inside, 4 matte black cards nestled like stones. "No rules," Oliver said. 3 days, unlimited. He heard his voice and felt the ethical alarm in his chest. This was not a social study sanctioned by any university. It was a stunt, a curiosity, a privilege exercised as if it were a laboratory. He knew that. He told himself he also meant it as a gift. In the quiet that followed, James only nodded. The 4 names were written on a post-it stuck to the inside lid. Susanna, Valeria, Daisy, Grace. Susanna Williams was efficient. Sharp suits, sharper answers. She had become indispensable. Oliver trusted her with schedules, with 100 little crises, and with a certain unflinching appetite for upward mobility. She looked at the black card as if it were a challenge. What she bought would be an investment, she told herself, not a splurge. Valeria moved like money made flesh. Photographs had never caught the ease with which she turned a room into a runway. She treated every purchase as content. Dresses, dinners, attention. A card in her hands was simply another opportunity to be seen. Daisy Patterson was drama in stilettos, a carefully cultivated flame. She had known Oliver when things were different. Sometimes she sounded like nostalgia, sometimes like accusation. She smiled too wide when she received the card, a flash that suggested spectacle. And then there was Grace Williams, no relation to Susanna, who came on weekdays to fold his shirts and clean the corners of a life that rarely allowed itself to be messy. Grace moved quietly, never loudly, and she had a laugh that surprised Oliver with its brightness. He had watched her for months, how she lingered by the window of the elevator to straighten a crooked picture, how she hummed off-key to herself while ironing. She wore sensible shoes, carried a lunchbox with a hand-sewn napkin, and, for all the ways she remained invisible in his world, somehow kept the place she worked feeling like a human home. Oliver placed a card in each woman's palm and announced the rules with the detached curiosity of a man describing physics. Spend anything, buy whatever you want. No limits. No receipts necessary. He would find out later. He told them they had 3 days. 3 days of freedom, Susanna said, smiling in a way that said she already knew what she would do with it. "Who are you betting on?" James asked as Susanna left the penthouse, heels clicking a metronome. "Not betting," Oliver said, "observing." And the observing began. Susanna's spree read like a plan. She hired a small army of consultants. Event designers, a PR firm, a consultant who specialized in magnificent entrances. There were invoices for a private helicopter rental, contracts for an exclusive caterer, a deposit on a venue that had chandeliers like hanging stars. She bought outfits that seemed to be stitched from the glare of camera flashes and reserved a celebrated speechwriter, someone who could sprinkle the right kind of sentiment over the right kind of charity to make it taste like transformation. Valeria's purchases were nearly instantaneous, Instagram ready. A gown that shimmered like a twilight skyline, a bracelet that caught stray light and turned it into gossip,
A reservation at a restaurant known for names rather than food. She bought a photographer whose portfolio smelled of champagne and red carpets. Her shopping carried the punctuation of a headline. Daisy's tabs were a performance, a couture fitting, a line of expensive manicures, a rented vintage convertible for dramatic exits. She booked an appearance with a local morning show, something with spectacle, confetti, and tears if the mood called for it. Daisy's choices were loud, because Daisy herself was a threshold noise the world was always ready to notice. Then there was Grace. The receipts that slipped under Oliver's thumb an hour after the first round of purchases arrived like a small, unexpected poem. Bundles of balloons, bright, tacky with the cheap gloss of joy. Boxes of hot dog buns and hot dog rolls, stacks of napkins, washable paints in primary colors, a small practical sewing kit, a clown nose, a roll of streamers, jars of face paint, a van rental, modest and unmarked, billed simply as community outreach. No jewelry, no gowns, no plane tickets. No consultants, no PR spins. Oliver took in the list and felt an unanticipated ache. He had expected something small, a thank you, maybe a token. He had not expected orchestrated humility. He had not expected it to move him. "What is she doing with that?" James asked. He sounded almost amused, almost tender. "She's driving a van," Oliver said, and then, because he could not help himself, he followed. It was the kind of decision that looks impulsive only when seen from the outside. Inside, it felt inevitable.
He slipped into jeans, left his phone in his pocket without telling James, and walked down to the street to watch the van. Curiosity braided with a sort of dread that he might find the test had already failed at its first question. Grace's van wound through neighborhoods Oliver rarely visited. The penthouse receded behind him like a private memory. The city opened up differently at ground level. Laundromats with buzzing machines, a barber standing in his doorway, a bakery with steam on the glass. People said hello to one another, even those who had no reason to. Oliver watched Grace park the van in a narrow space beside a red brick building with weathered paint and a sign that read St. Francis Home. St. Francis Home was smaller than whatever image he had conjured. A clean cluster of rooms and a courtyard that had been claimed by some indefinable, sturdy kindness. Children's drawings taped to windows. A swing set that had once been blue and was now blue in the way something endures color through weather. Margaret, the director, came out and greeted Grace the way people greet each other who have kept appointments of the heart for years. Oliver kept to the shadows of the hedges and watched. Grace stepped out in an outfit that, if you asked an observer to describe its design, they might simply call mend and joy. Her blouse had a paint-splashed cuff. Her hands smelled faintly of flour and soap. She tied on a plastic clown bow and didn't look ridiculous so much as tender and resolute. Children gathered like magnets. Tommy, who had a mob of hair that refused to be tamed, shoved his face into a balloon for a second and laughed. Sarah offered her a crooked drawing of a sun. Michael, who liked to name things, called Grace Miss Fix-It because she could patch knees and impossible afternoons. Grace didn't put on performance, she put on warmth. She split a hot dog bun and handed it to a boy who had been saving his smile. She learned to blow up balloons the wrong way and taught an 8-year-old named Lila to do it better. She told a terrible off-key joke about a clown who lost his shoes, and the children laughed because laughter in a place like St. Francis often travels through disbelief into release. Oliver watched and realized he had never seen anyone do this work who did not think they were being watched. Grace, for all her modesty, actively ignored the camera of public opinion. Her gestures were simple. She patched a scraped knee with a band-aid she decorated with a painted star. She showed a shy toddler how to smear a bright blue streak of paint on a paper plate and call it a sky. She let a child stand on a little stool and pretend he was a pirate. When a boy started to cry because he missed someone, she crouched down, hand on his shoulder, and hummed a tune that neither sought pity nor applause, only presence. For the first time in a long while, Oliver felt like a burglar in his own life, stealing an intangible thing he had left unattended: empathy. The experiment had turned on a small, incandescent truth. Grace's purchases were not less glamorous because they lacked monetary showmanship. They were vast in a different currency. He lingered until dusk, until the courtyard lamps threw long halos over painted faces, and the smell of fried hot dogs braided with sugar from cupcakes baked by a volunteer. He saw Margaret watch Grace with a gratitude that was almost relieved. The director's eyes were the kind that have cataloged good deeds and heartbreaks and still choose to stay. That night, Oliver could not sleep. He lay on the dark side of his bed in the penthouse and thought of the sound of children laughing, of Grace's crooked smile, of the cheap plastic of a clown nose, turning into a kind of sacrament because a small child had found transcendence in it. He kept thinking of the black card burning a hole in his pocket, a talisman of indefinite power, and how Grace had turned its weight into something light. He told himself the experiment needed to continue. If what he wanted was truth, truth required seeing all the choices. He had to let the other women spend, to watch the contrast. He had enlisted no one else's permission. He had placed people under a test that had moral grayness stitched into it. That ethical disquiet tugged at him, a small, insistent knot. He had to admit, even to himself, that there was a kind of cruelty to it. He had to believe the ends could justify the means, if the ends were revelation and the means were an honest look at people's priorities. The second day arrived in a flurry of receipts and curated photos that reached Oliver like evidence. Valeria posted a selfie in a suite of mirrors, her gown catching every angle. The caption hinted at charity but belonged more to the currency of attention. Daisy uploaded a clip where she described buying a fresh start and flashed a smile that the camera liked. Susanna's purchases began coalescing into an event plan, an evening of carefully timed speeches and staged reveals that promised to convert donation into headline. Only Grace's van returned to St. Francis with new bags of chips and more hot dog rolls. She painted a banner that read "Fun Day" in letters that leaned into each other like friends. She found a way to attach a string of battery-powered lights to the swing set, and the children named her Lightmaker. She refused help with a modest stubbornness that made Oliver want to step forward and offer every hand he had, with no performance, with no camera, just because. On the morning of the third day, Oliver invited James to look at the receipts with him. James spread them out across the breakfast table like a deck of lives. Invoices for a helicopter, a couture gown, a reserved ballroom, corporate sponsorship fees, balloon arches with brand names, and then, tucked beside them like a secret message, Grace's list. Paint, buns, balloons, a clown nose, a van rental. Their instinct was what you expected, James said. One builds an image, one invests in leverage, one crafts spectacle. And Grace, she built a party. Built a home, Oliver corrected quietly. By then, James had watched Oliver do things people in Oliver's world rarely did. He had walked down to St. Francis twice, left notes, bought replacement paint when the cheap kind ran out. It would have been easy, James thought, for Oliver to tilt this into philanthropy the way men with money liked to do. Logos, press releases, a gala named after the donor's foundation. But something about Grace stripped that impulse of its glamour. "You're changing the place," James said. "I don't know that I'm allowed to change anything," Oliver replied. "This was a test. It was supposed to tell me who people are." "Who are you saying you are?" James asked. The question landed like gravel. Oliver didn't answer. The weekend that followed felt like a rehearsal for a different life. Oliver watched the city from his glass box and thought about the faces in St. Francis's courtyard. He thought about how the penthouse looked colder because someone else warmed the world down below. He found himself making small, anonymous gestures, dropping off a pallet of winter coats to a shelter he'd never visited, leaving a check for school supplies. But he didn't announce them.
He was trying to understand the difference between being seen and seeing. And then the most ecstatic, improbable thing happened. Grace was invited, softly and without her name in lights, to serve at a modest event Margaret and the shelter had been invited to attend. It would not be a gala in the glittering sense. It would be a local fundraiser hungry for authenticity. Susanna, in the meantime, was moving forward with her plan to stage an event with the kind of press pull that could tilt the city's wealth toward a cause, if the messaging landed right. Oliver watched both threads twine: the manufactured spectacle and the small, messy party of a shelter. He wanted to see what value they each yielded. He was hungry for comparison, even as his appetite had been rearranged by what he had already seen. At St. Francis, Grace practiced a short speech Margaret had coaxed from her, the kind of speech that should be unpolished and truthful. It began with a sentence that made Oliver remember the day he first noticed her humming while ironing his shirts. "I get the best part of my day here." It was simple, it was true. When Grace rehearsed, she tripped over a word and laughed, then corrected herself, cheeks pink, the way someone embarrassed and honest does.
She told a story about a boy who had drawn a rocket to escape a Tuesday that no child should have to plan for. She told it not to make people feel bad, but to invite them to help. Her voice cracked, not from showmanship, but from everything that made the moment fragile. Oliver felt a fear he had not anticipated, that the world would prefer the polished, that headline-friendly philanthropy would eat the smallness alive. He had set this test. The stakes were his own conscience. He found himself picturing Daisy in a gown under a spotlight, Susanna cueing the exact minute a donor would stand, Valeria arranging for the flashes to catch the perfect teardrop, and he wondered whether the audience's generosity depended more on spectacle than on truth. He'd always thought spectacle could translate into action. He'd given money to causes with glossy reports, and had sometimes felt satisfaction that was the color of a press release. But in the courtyard at St. Francis, when the children plastered Grace's face with sticky tape masks and she kissed their foreheads with paint still on her fingers, Oliver realized that there was another metric for worth: the capacity to be present without demand. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the penthouse window that night and watched the city breathe. He tried to imagine the gala he might find in 3 days, an engineered swerve of generosity where the richest people in the city would speak about change and then go back to lives threaded with the same comforts. He tried to imagine Grace on a small stage, telling an honest story. On the morning of the event, Grace drove the van to the shelter as she always did, but Oliver suspected she would be invited to sit with the organizers in the evening, a small, hopeful elevation. He sat on his chaise lounge and fished through invitations in his mail, wondering if any of them would ring true, or if they were instruments of a generosity that wanted public return. That afternoon, a staffer at St. Francis called Oliver's office. The voice on the line was practical, neither seeking money nor thanks, just informing. "We're hosting a small reception. Grace has been invaluable," she said, and hung up. Oliver felt a strange tug, a desire to be present for the way the world revealed itself, honest or staged. He dressed in a jacket that was softer than his usual choices, the fabric chosen by habit rather than statement. He walked out into the afternoon and again found himself drawn to the shelter. This time he would not lurk. He would cross the courtyard and stand among them, not a proprietor. He arrived to find the courtyard full of folding chairs that had been painted with love by volunteers. A string of lights, Grace's idea, halos above a makeshift stage. There was a good-natured chaos, volunteers fussing with plates, a man who'd been a musician in another life tuning a guitar, children passing out programs they had illustrated with crayons. Margaret found him and offered him a simple cup of coffee without pretense. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. "We started an early art swap." "I wanted to see," Oliver said, and his tone was truer even than he intended.
When Grace climbed the low stage to speak, she did so without notes, only a ragged piece of cloth she had found and smoothed into her hands like a talisman. She told the story of a girl who taught her to count using jelly beans, of a boy who loved maps and wanted to know where his future would be. She said softly but clearly, "I get the best part of my day here." It was the sentence Oliver had watched her practice, and tonight it landed like an honest coin. There was no chandelier to catch her speech. There were, however, faces upturned with attention, and when she finished, the applause felt like rain, small and steady, not orchestrated but real. Oliver walked forward, clapping quietly. In the back of the courtyard, he watched her wipe sweat from her brow with the corner of her apron. She moved through the crowd, accepting thanks like someone slightly embarrassed by attention but not unwilling to feel it. It was then he made a decision. He stepped up to help take down the chairs, to move plates to the compost, to clean the spill and fold the uneven napkins. These were small tasks, domestic almost, and Oliver did them with the bare hands of a man who had never learned how to be small. Grace glanced at him and offered a faint, surprised smile, like someone seeing a new light through a familiar window. "You don't have to," Margaret said as he handed her a stack of paper plates, "but thank you." Later that evening, after the lights had been coiled and the kids were half asleep under blankets, Oliver found himself alone with Grace by the swing set. She leaned back and watched a boy tuck a drawing under his pillow. Her hands were still scented with the markers from the day. "You didn't have to come," she said, as if she were reminding him of a courtesy. "I wanted to," he said. It was the simplest and truest confession he could offer in that moment. There was a pause that felt like a small geography. "Was this your test?" Grace asked, as if she were trying to name a thing she might be angry about. She had not been bitter during the event. She had been generous in a way that cost nothing and everything. Oliver swallowed. The experiment sat like a card on the table between them. "It's complicated," he said. "I thought I was looking for something out there." He gestured vaguely toward the city, toward the place his life had become. "But I think I found it here." Grace's laughter was a soft sound that shook off the day's dust. "Well, I hope what you found was decent," she said. "Not everyone gets to be decent on purpose." He wanted to tell her he had miscalculated the cost of his curiosity, that tests could wound, that placing people under observation could poison what they were trying to grow. But the words disintegrated on his tongue. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry if I made you feel like anything less than what you are." Grace looked at him then with a clarity that both steadied and unsettled him. "You gave me something I didn't ask for," she said, "and I used it. That's all." There was an economy in the sentence, no demand, no resentment that could not be fell under the category of small human disappointment. They stood under a halo of lights, the city murmuring beyond the brick walls, and Oliver felt the friction of contradictory impulses, the urge to announce her kindness, to set it on a pedestal he controlled, versus the growing understanding that authenticity could not be made into a spectacle without losing its marrow. He left with a small sense of restitution. He had seen. He had stepped down from the glass. He had touched the ground. And in the quiet of his return, news began to whisper, an echo in the modern age that traveled in pixels and half-truths. A photograph surfaced on a local blog, a snapshot from the fundraiser, a man in the front row whose face the camera had caught mid-laugh, and a caption that hinted at generosity without specifying its source. Oliver saw it and at first felt nothing more than annoyance at the clickbait slant. Then a push notification arrived, a headline, unadorned and hungry, that changed the curve of his evening. Somewhere in the churn of the city's feed, a voice had already begun to shape a narrative. He turned off his phone and stood at the window again. The experiments, he realized too late, rarely remain contained. Tests leak, stories mutate. He had set a simple challenge and now watched as the city, with its appetite for spectacle, started to chew. For now, though, there was only the memory of small hands and glitter paint. For now, there was the trace of Grace's laughter, and the way the children at St. Francis had named her Lightmaker. For now, he held both gratitude and an acute, uncomfortable recognition. By turning people into a question, he had put them at risk. He did not know how much of the test he would reveal. He did not know whether he would stand in the front when a rumor turned to accusation. He only knew that after 3 days and 4 black cards, what should have been a trivial experiment had unclipped something in him. That night, Oliver dreamed of balloons drifting past his glass towers, each one filled with small, persistent truths. When he woke, the city was already awake, too. And somewhere in the din, someone had planted a seed of trouble, an image with an insinuation attached, like a barbed promise. He could not yet see how deep it would run, only that it would not be shallow. The test had started as an answer to his curiosity. It was fast becoming a question that required deeds, not conjecture. He found himself counting the hours until he could go back to St. Francis.
Until he could ask Margaret for a list of needs that matched Grace's small, important purchases. He wanted to be useful in a way that didn't seek applause. Before leaving the penthouse, he took the black leather box from its drawer. 3 cards were used now, 1 remained in its slot. He slid that last card into his pocket without thinking. It felt heavy, as if it had become an instrument not for spending, but for promising. For him, at least, the meaning had changed. Outside, the city was a mosaic of choices. Inside, Oliver felt the tug of consequences, ethical and fragile. He had staged an experiment. He had observed an answer. He had not yet braced for what might come when the world decided to interpret their choices for them. So tell me, where are you watching from? Type your city below. I want to know who's watching this little story unfold tonight. Oliver stepped into a cab bound for St. Francis, the card in his pocket, the city moving around him with indifferent speed. He did not yet see the scandal that would be sown hours later, or the way the concocted whisper of a story would test the fragile stitches of trust around the shelter. He could not yet know who would be tempted to believe the loudest version of life. He only knew that what began as a dare had become, in 3 days, a kind of reckoning. When he arrived at St. Francis, the courtyard was quiet in the late afternoon hum. Swing seats empty, paint cups drying in the sun. He paused at the gate and noticed something he had not seen before. The children's drawings lining the fence, each one pinned with a clothespin, a small archive of ordinary bravery. He reached out and ran a finger over a picture of a rocket, then turned at the sound of a tiny voice. "Oliver!" called Tommy from behind a bush where he had been hiding, a grin like a comet. Grace stood there, wiping her hands on her apron, and for a moment the city and all its cards and headlines felt very, very far away. She looked at him with that steady, uncomplicated gaze that had rerouted his expectations. He walked toward her, and the children clustered like a promise. He had not decided whether to reveal everything he had done or to let some things remain private. He had not decided how to fix the ethical fracture his experiment had made. He had only decided to be present. "Thanks for coming," Grace said simply. He smiled, and for once his smile was not an artifact. It reached his eyes. "I have a feeling I'll be coming back," he said. "A lot." Grace shrugged, as if this was not extraordinary, but rather precisely the sort of thing to be expected from people who unexpectedly find their way to doing what matters. She turned and called the children to line up for an improvised parade, a small procession from the courtyard to the dining hall, balloons bobbing like slow planets. Oliver watched them march and felt something inside him make a quiet, irrevocable choice. He would not simply be the man who tested. He would be the man who answered. He did not know the shape of the answer yet. He only felt its gravity. As the parade wound past him, a balloon brushed his sleeve. He picked it up and tucked it under his arm. It was a trivial thing, and yet it felt like a contract he had signed without a pen. To see, to show up, to protect. He had no idea, standing there with a squeaky balloon and a heart that had finally found a language for contrition, that a story would be planted the next morning, one that would ask everyone to choose sides before the facts were clear. He had no idea that, in the days to come, his hesitation to leap into defense would be read as weakness, and that Grace would be offered the bitter, humiliating choice between fight and flight. For now, though, the air was bright with the smell of popcorn and paint. For now, a child named Michael handed Oliver a paper hat he had made, crooked and joyful. Oliver put it on with ceremonial seriousness and watched Grace laugh, not at him, but with him, the kind of laugh that does not require the world to understand to be enough. The experiment, he realized, had given him something he hadn't anticipated, a mirror. It reflected not only what others did with his allowance, but what he had done with his power. He had to reckon, and he had to choose. From the sidewalk, the city blazed indifferent and loud. Inside the small red-bricked shelter, something careful was building, bands of repair stitched by ordinary hands. Oliver folded a paper hat and tucked it in his pocket, a little talisman to remind him of a different accounting. When he left St. Francis that evening, he did so with a promise, unspoken but solid, to do more than watch. He would follow the story that had begun in his penthouse, not because he liked the sensation of control, but because the experiment had exposed responsibility as something that could not be outsourced to PR firms or dazzling venues. He did not yet know that others would try to reshape the narrative in the days ahead. He did not know the voices that would conspire to turn generosity into scandal. He only knew that the black cards had shown him a measure of something priceless, and that would change how he spent the rest of his life. And as he walked away, a paper hat tucked into his pocket, he felt the weight of choice settle next to the leather of the cards. Heavy, consequential, human. The 3 days were over, but everything, in aching and hopeful ways, was just beginning. The morning the story broke, the city felt smaller and louder all at once. It began as a thin, poisonous line on a local blog, an insinuation wrapped in a photo and 2 careless sentences. Overnight, it metastasized into screen grabs and trending tags. A headline accusing a woman from St. Francis Home of pocketing funds meant for the shelter, a rumor framed like fact. The post showed a doctored invoice captioned with the suggestion that Grace had used Oliver's black card to funnel money into her own account. A blogger known for gossip picked it up. An influencer with a taste for outrage added commentary. Within hours, it had the velocity of wildfire. Oliver saw the first alert above his bed, and then the second and the third. He watched as the insinuation gathered followers like a storm pulls leaves. The feeds filled with angry comments, well-meaning outraged donors, and the kind of cruelty the internet does so well. Instant, loud, and often lazy about facts. Someone made a montage of images from the 3 days and slid in a falsified bank transfer. Someone else reused a photo from an unrelated event and stamped it as proof. The architecture of rumor collapsed quickly into a single, devastating narrative. Grace had betrayed St. Francis. Oliver's phone vibrated with messages. Lawyers? PR? Statements to prepare? James, steady as ever, read each flashing screen and then read the room in Oliver's face. "What do you want to do?" James asked. Counselors would say, "Move fast, deny everything, litigate the truth." PR playbooks would say, "Issue a deflection and let facts follow." Oliver knew those moves. He had paid consultants to perform them. He also knew that when he had the power to shape the narrative, he had often preferred to delay a raw confession until he could manufacture the right optics. He hesitated. Grace saw the hesitation as abandonment. By the time Oliver dialed Margaret at St. Francis, he had composed and recomposed a public defense, weighed the risk of amplifying the rumor by speaking too early,
and told himself that silence might prevent more lies. Margaret was pragmatic and immediate. The shelter was receiving calls, donors were pausing automatic payments, volunteers were second-guessing their schedules. They named her, Margaret said flatly. People want names. People will burn the person who fills the headline. Say something, James pressed when Oliver paused on the edge of a public statement. Let them hear that we're investigating. Don't let the vacuum speak for you. And yet, Oliver found his fingers frozen over the keyboard. Saying the wrong thing could mean legal exposure. Saying the right thing required telling the world the truth, that he had orchestrated an experiment at people's expense. That would mean admitting culpability in a moral wrong, not merely defending Grace. It would mean exposing his arrogance, the very thing he had been trying to atone for. He turned his face into his hands and, for the first time in the week, felt the full weight of consequence. Grace did not wait for the official channels. She had always been principled in immediate ways. The way she straightened cushions without expecting thanks. The way she handed out a second cookie without counting the cost. The accusations landed on her like a physical blow, even though they were digital in form. Volunteers at St.
Francis tried to shield her. Donors called seeking proof. The children asked thin, precise questions about why strangers were mean. "I can't," Grace told Margaret, voice steady but brittle. "I won't be the reason anyone stops coming. If they think I did this, maybe I should go until it calms." She packed a small bag that night, no spectacle, only essentials, and left the next morning before the shelter opened. She told Margaret she needed space, and she left a note for the children that read, in her careful handwriting, "I'll be back when you need me." It was the kind of line that could be read as hope or as unmade promise. Tommy cried for an hour because someone had taken his light maker. Michael kept his drawing under his pillow and refused to talk about what the world was saying. Oliver received Grace's message, short, explaining she had gone to clear her head, and with it the sharpest, most primitive sting. He had hurt someone he admired by his experiment, and then compounded the damage by hesitating when the world wanted a line of defense. The news feeds did not care about his crisis of conscience. They wanted characters and villains. He went to St. Francis that afternoon alone and found the courtyard quieter, the art on the fence slightly askew. The volunteers were brave in the small, daily ways that people are when they do not have the luxury of spectacle, folding napkins, steaming a small kettle, smoothing a child's blanket. Margaret looked at him with that catalogue of long-sighted kindness and said, without accusation, she needed to go. Oliver left again with his pockets full of the thin, corrosive knowledge that he had to act, not with press releases or posturing, but in a way that would restore a person's name and dignity. James, by contrast, favored action. He disliked the limbo of waiting. He wanted to investigate, not to bury the story in statements. He reminded Oliver how the conspiracy had a mouth, and that mouths left traces, emails, messages, receipts, footage. If someone made this up, James said, they left fingerprints. So they started there. Oliver handed James free rein. "Find what you can," he said. "Be smart, be careful, and no theatrics without evidence." James smiled a small conspiratorial smile and prepared for a kind of scavenger hunt that suited him perfectly. They trawled through the trail of the experiment. Invoices, vendor emails, the delivery logs from the van rental, the caterer's receipts. Most of it was straightforward. The balloon vendor confirmed a phone order placed under Grace's name. The hot dog supplier showed a charge tied to the community outreach line item. None of that was sinister, unless someone had decided to weave it into a narrative that presented giving as theft. James's first break came from a minor human error. Susanna, efficient, slick, sometimes careless in ways that only hurry can explain, had left an email chain open on her laptop in the penthouse conference room one late evening after a meeting. James, who had seen the human susceptibility of people in power before, had an errant thumb and an errant curiosity. He glanced, he scrolled, and he found a series of messages between Susanna and an email address registered under a known gossip blogger. The messages were cautious, yet transactional. A photo in exchange for a push, a promise of scoops for the right price, an oblique reference to building momentum against a narrative the writer claimed would pop. It was the kind of thing that in a normal universe might mean nothing. But the email thread contained attachments. One of them a draft with the word invoice in the title and a file that had been altered to show a payment from Grace to a private account. The metadata was messy but telling. The document had been edited on a laptop in Oliver's building at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the same building where Susanna had access. It was enough to make James's pulse pick up. They needed more. Evidence that a document was doctored could be disputed. They needed a confession, a recorded boast, a clip of someone arranging the lie. James's next move was less elegant and more human. He simply followed where the breadcrumbs led. A coffee shop where Susanna and Daisy liked to stage urgent, businessy meetups. He sat at a table pretending to read a screenplay and watched Susanna arrive, immaculate and alert, with Daisy trailing like a curated storm. They laughed in a way that suggested rehearsal. They spoke about an influencer who had eaten up toxicity in a feed. They spoke about how quickly lies could translate into a lock of cash for an event if they cleverly redirected attention. James recorded the conversation quietly, his phone discreet under the table, the way an assistant does when the stakes are no longer abstract. He recorded a fragment of Daisy's voice. "We push this, make Grace the villain. He'll have to step up or look like a fool. Either way, we get the spotlight." Susanna's reply was softer, more measured. "We'll plant an invoice, make it look like a transfer. The blog will run. He'll react. People will take sides. We'll be the heroes who fix it." It was almost audacious in its clarity. But recording a cafe conversation and a doctored document was not enough to top a global whisper. They needed proof that the blog had been paid, that the invoice had been manufactured, that there had been a deliberate attempt to weaponize the experiment for social advantage. James dug further. He contacted the third-party email provider. He found IP logs showing a login from a cafe's network at roughly the time Susanna and Daisy had met. He subpoenaed. No, he did not have legal authority, because Oliver was not yet pursuing court. But he asked friends who had tech knowledge to look into host logs and to check caches of the blogger's site. An older security guard at Oliver's building remembered Susanna rushing out late one night with a padded envelope. A security camera at a copy shop around the corner recorded an odd hour in the early morning when a woman in a long coat handed over a flash drive to the shop clerk. They obtained the footage, and, when played in slow motion, there was Susanna's profile, unmistakable in the way she tilted her head as if to rehearse a line. It was the sort of evidence that, once assembled, began to buttress suspicion into a case. But the arc of the conspiracy had the mercy of small mistakes. Daisy, in her desire to bask in the chaos she had sown, left a voicemail on her own phone, in a moment of bragging to an old friend, an audible slip of triumphage. "We made sure the right person looked bad tonight," she laughed, unaware that the friend, appalled by the strategy, had forwarded the message to a mutual acquaintance. The acquaintance, disgusted, passed it to Margaret. Margaret, who managed St. Francis the way a gardener tends an old tree, patiently, with a stubborn refusal to be scandalized by gossip, listened and then came to Oliver with a plan he had not expected but desperately needed. Hold the conversation in public where grace and evidence could meet rumor face to face. Oliver, who had planned the experiment, had to own not only the moral reckoning but the technical one. He had to reveal that he had, in fact, given the cards in a private act that he now recognized as harmful. It would be messy, it would be confessional, but the alternative was to let the rumor calcify. He arranged a press event at St. Francis, a simple gathering in the courtyard, under the lights that had once haloed the children's parade. He invited journalists, donors, volunteers, and anyone else who would listen. He told James to bring everything, the email prints, the cafe recording, the copy shop footage, the voicemail. He asked Margaret to invite the shelter supporters, and he asked Robert Whitfield and David Richardson, philanthropists who had been moved at the fundraiser, to attend as witnesses.
There was still one unpredictability left. Grace had not agreed to come. She had left town, renting a room in a modest boarding house 3 boroughs away. She slept badly and ate worse, and she spent time in afternoons volunteering at a small community kitchen, simply to keep her hands busy. The children's names were tattooed on her days. She called Margaret every other night and refused to re-enter the public stage until she felt the narrative had shifted into truth. When Margaret insisted that she come back, Grace hesitated. "What if they don't want me?" she asked. "What if people believe the story?" "You didn't write it," Margaret said gently.
You just need to let the truth be heard. Grace agreed, finally, not because she relished the center stage, but because the children needed the story corrected. "For them," she said, "I'll come for them." The press conference was not slick. There was no velvet curtain, no backdrop with logos. There was a folding table with a pitcher of water, a microphone with a crackle, and a blue tarp on which the children had painted a banner months ago. Oliver took the microphone first. He did not offer the polished defense he had rehearsed. He began, instead, with an admission. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, voice stripped of management. "I used my money and my curiosity to test people in a way that was unfair and hurtful. That's my fault. But the woman being accused of stealing from St. Francis did no such thing. A lie was planted to make her look guilty. I owe her and all of you the truth." He did not ask for forgiveness yet. He laid out the evidence, carefully, calmly. He explained how 3 days of 4 cards had been given, how purchases had been made, how one of the cards had been used exactly as Grace had insisted it be used, to buy small things that made children laugh. He showed receipts and vendor confirmations. Then James took over with the harder proof. The email thread to the blogger, the copy shop footage of a woman handing over a flash drive, the cafe recording of Susanna and Daisy's discussion framed in quiet arrogance. He played the voicemail where Daisy had laughed at their success. The courtyard was a ruckus of murmurs. Cameras flashed, some people leaned in, and some folded their arms. Susanna and Daisy were both in the crowd. Susanna's face a careful mask of composure, Daisy's expression a mixture of defiance and fragile triumph. The recordings played like a slow unspooling of a plan that had seemed clever until it met consequence. Under pressure, Susanna did something Oliver had not expected. She walked forward. Her voice was tight, but she did not deny what she had done. I thought I was making a necessary disturbance," she said, as if explaining and excusing could cohabit. "I thought it would get attention and we would be seen as saviors in the aftermath." Tears sprang up as if from a faucet. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Daisy, who had the habit of dramatizing remorse like it was part of a costume change, tried for an apology that was equal parts calculated and deflective. But the voicemail that had been played showed the raw truth, her amusement at having started a fire. The crowd's patience dwindled. You could see, in the faces of volunteers who had spent winters wrapping children's coats, that this had cut deep. Oliver stepped back to the microphone. His apology was not a press statement. It was a small, honest speech, one he had rehearsed in waking hours and then thrown away to speak with the voice of someone who had learned. He admitted his experiment and its cruelty, and said plainly that the city's appetite for spectacle could devastate lives when wielded unethically. He named the harm he had done, directly and quietly, to Grace for making her the center of a test she had never signed up for. The room softened. The cameras kept rolling, because cameras record everything, and the world likes miraculous arcs, the powerful admitting error and the small being vindicated. Margaret stepped forward and, without theatrics, described Grace's work, the hours she had given, the nights she had stayed late to sew costumes for the kids' play, the small ways a person keeps a place alive. The children, emboldened by Margaret and by a kind of honest impulse that children feel when adults behave badly and then try to repair it, stood and testified in their blunt, wonderful way. Tommy described a hat Grace had made him. Lila recited a joke she had learned from Grace. Michael said that Miss Fix-It had stitched his torn superhero cape when no one else could.
Their words were small and precise and contained more moral weight than any prepared donor statement. They did not deliver cliches, they delivered witnesses. Grace listened from the edge of the crowd, hands folded, not certain whether to step forward. When the children finished, there was a hush. Oliver stepped away from the microphone and walked to the edge of the tarp where Grace stood. The two of them faced each other amid the hum of a courtyard that had, for a moment, returned to its ordinary human frequency. "I am sorry," Oliver said simply, "for putting you through that, for not defending you sooner, for thinking a game could tell me how to value people." Grace's response was neither immediate capitulation nor cold refusal. She looked at him the way she looked at uneven drawings and crooked chairs, tenderly, with the precision of someone who repairs things but keeps the scar as memory. "You hurt people," she said, "and I left because I didn't want my being here to be what made people stop giving." She spoke with the economy of someone who had decided long ago to measure words. "But I'm not a headline. I'm a person who helps kids make necklaces out of pasta when they feel empty. That's my life. If you're sorry, show it by what you do next." Oliver looked up and met her gaze. He did not have to promise a press stunt or a gala. He promised the thing that had begun in the penthouse and that he had resisted, presence. He promised to make changes, structural, financial, and human, that would protect St. Francis from the whims of headlines. He promised publicly to fund a transparent program that would cover the shelter's needs without branding, without fanfare, and with oversight that included Margaret and the board. There was an awkward pause. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone laughed, afraid, relieved laughter. The audience broke into something close to applause. Susanna walked away, face a map of shame. Daisy's bravado dried to brittle heat, and she left with a friend who tried to console but could not quiet the public shame. Grace did not leap into reconciliation immediately. Forgiveness, for her, had the requirements of dignity. She wanted to know that the apology would be more than sound bites. She wanted the record to be set straight, not just for her, but for the children whose lives had been used as a backdrop. Oliver gave them everything he could. He publicly authorized an audit to be overseen by the shelter's board. He proposed that the gift be made in the name of the children, not his brand. He handed the microphone to Margaret and let her speak about autonomy, about the need for shelters to determine their own futures without being made into props for someone else's redemption story. The last piece of the unveiling was a quiet one. Susanna's confession in the clear audio clip they played again, but slower and with no background music. Her voice admitting to conspiring with Daisy to plant the article and overheard statements about manipulating public opinion. It was raw evidence in layman's terms, and it moved something in people's faces. Grace watched all of it in a way that was both patient and watchful. She paced the length of the courtyard at one point, fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. The reporters lined up for comments. The city began, slowly, to pivot. When the dust settled, a small group gathered under the lights. Grace, Margaret, Oliver, James, a few board members, and the children who had been unwilling witnesses. Oliver stepped toward Grace and then knelt, an odd action neither quite theatrical nor quite intimate, and offered her a paper hat he had kept in his pocket since the day he had left the shelter with one tucked away like a talisman. "For making kids feel like the center of the world," he said, in a voice that trembled in a good way. "For teaching me how to be small and why that matters. Will you let me help, properly this time?" Grace laughed, soft, surprised, like a bell that had been wound too tight. She reached out and took his hand. "You've got a lot to learn," she said with gentle mockery, "and a lot to fix." "I do," he answered, "and I want to try." It was not the sweeping engagement that movies compress into 3 minutes, but it was honest. Oliver offered partnership in practical terms. Regular volunteer hours, a trust for the shelter governed by people who lived their mission, and small, ongoing commitments that did not require banners. He promised to rebuild the way he had previously built, this time from the ground, not the penthouse.
Their reconciliation did not cure the aftermath overnight. Online threads still accused them of staging parts of it. Some donors demanded receipts and corporate governance documents. But many more were moved to donate because the story had shifted from scandal to repair. Confirmed donors like David Richardson and Robert Whitfield committed to multi-year support for St. Francis, not because it would be photographed, but because they believed in the children who had spoken simply and bravely. For Grace, the healing came in quiet increments. She returned to St. Francis and resumed her small revolutions of kindness, mending costumes, stitching up knees, teaching kids how to fold a paper hat into a crown. People stopped calling her a villain and started calling her by the name she preferred. It was slow but steady. Oliver kept his promise to be present in small, messy ways. He learned to sweep the floor after an event and discovered that being clumsy with a broom felt strangely like contrition. Their romantic arc was not a sudden conflagration. It was something that grew out of time spent together in spaces that softened him and that allowed her to see him without the steel he usually wore. He took to walking with Margaret to get the cheap coffee she liked, to sitting on the floor while children built block towns rather than holding court in a leather chair. They cooked together awkwardly for community dinners, Oliver with a fire alarm habit, Grace with a laugh that made the smoke seem funny. They argued occasionally about money, how to spend it, who to trust with its stewardship, like any pair who was trying to reconcile vastly different life histories. The penthouse warmed in color. The chrome surfaces accumulated fingerprints. Oliver swapped out some art for children's paintings and made space for worn furniture that invited boots and jackets and the noise of life. He began hosting dinners that were not events, but invitations. Neighbors from the shelter, old friends who had supported the city's social fabric, and sometimes, quietly, the children who liked to run a race from the elevator to the balcony rail. The penthouse ceased to be a polished exhibit and became a living room. James, who had watched and judged and occasionally enabled Oliver's worst impulses, loved the new disorder. "This is nicer than the gallery show," he admitted one night, fluffing a pillow with austere pleasure. Romance crept in on the edges of shared labor, a hand reaching across a tray of sandwiches, a thumb wiping paint from a cheek, a kiss that was more gratitude than zeal shared in the doorway between the kitchen and the courtyard. The first time they kissed under the swing set, it was brief and ordinary in a way that made it perfect. Two people who had been altered and who wanted to be known for who they had become, not simply who they had been. Time, as it does, lengthened the story into an epilogue of sorts. St. Francis flourished in ways that were practical and not particularly picturesque. A new patch of insulation in the roof, funded anonymously at first, then openly. A program for after-school tutoring that used volunteers from across the city. A modest grant that helped stabilize the shelter for a year. The black cards, once used as an instrument of curiosity, were locked in a drawer and, eventually, ceremoniously destroyed in a small gathering where members of the community stamped them with paint and then disposed of them properly. An act that symbolized a new ethic. For Oliver and Grace, the proposal was not a televised spectacle. He planned a small dinner in the shelter's dining hall. No PR, no press, just a table, some mismatched chairs, and a cake made by the kids using the shelter's old recipe. He had James help him choose a ring that was not a statement of wealth, but a plain piece of gold with a small, imperfect stone. A ring that looked like something a person would pass down because it had been worn into warmth. When he asked, he did not kneel in a way meant to produce a headline. He knelt to be at eye level with the person who had taught him to value presence. "Will you keep doing life with me?" he asked. Not the tests or the experiments, just the real, small things. The messy dinners, the mornings with paint on our hands. "Will you marry me?" Grace laughed, then cried a little, then nodded. The children, who had long ago insisted on being present for anything important, cheered and presented a hand-drawn banner that read, "Lights Forever," in uneven letters. They celebrated with confetti made from colored papers and silicone spatulas for hats. It was imperfect and beautiful. The city liked it very little, but the people who mattered loved it fiercely. The wedding was at St. Francis.
There were no lilies worth noting, no red carpet. There were, however, folding chairs brought into the courtyard, a simple arch of garlands, and the choir of small, untrained voices who sang with the gusto only children can muster. Margaret officiated in her practical, moving way. Guests wore what they could, a donated tux here, a worn cashmere there. Susanna and Daisy did not attend. Some wounds are not to be hastily knotted back together. But many people came. The volunteers, the donors who stayed through the scandal into the repair, neighbors from blocks away, and the few cynical journalists who had learned that second acts sometimes require patience. Oliver and Grace exchanged vows that were short and personal. He promised to listen more than he spoke. She promised to let him be a man who learned in public rather than sneaking truth into news feeds. They kissed, this time with a small public tenderness that did not need amplification. The years that followed were not flawless. Mistakes were made, old headlines resurfaced occasionally. Oliver sometimes reverted to an impulse to measure generosity in grandiose ways. But the penthouse remained open to the children on Saturdays. St. Francis expanded modestly on the foundation of goodwill and oversight. The experiment that had begun as a selfish question ended as a careful, communal project. Oliver became less interested in tests and more interested in being accountable.
He set up a small advisory board that included Margaret, a child development specialist, and a representative from the shelter's families. They met at long rectangular tables to decide on budgets, to debate pantry suppliers, and to argue about how much glitter was appropriate for party days. He listened. He wrote fewer press statements and more checks with clear audits. He learned that wealth's greatest ethical demand is to accept supervision. People often ask what really changed, what the black cards taught the world. The answer is not a single line. It is in small, steady acts. A wealthy man who learns to fold paper hats. A housekeeper who becomes a partner in a new life. Not because the city granted her celebrity, but because a community reclaimed its voice. The children who grow up knowing their names are not clickbait. The title, "This Billionaire Gave 4 Women Black Credit Cards, You Won't Believe Their Choices," remains a good hook for a story that is messier than a headline and infinitely more human. Years later, a reporter asked Oliver whether he regretted the experiment. He said he regretted how he had started it, but he did not regret the lessons it forced him to learn. He said that sincerity is not a commodity to be purchased, and that the true test of wealth is the willingness to be held accountable by people you have not paid to applaud you. At St. Francis, birthdays were celebrated with paint-streaked banners and hot dogs that were both high and low cuisine depending on the child's perspective. Oliver and Grace hosted community dinners where people from different blocks brought one dish and sat around the same table. There were debates and sometimes arguments, and always someone who cleared dishes at the end of the night. Sometimes, when the city pulsed with the old hunger for the sensational, Oliver would sit in the living room of his penthouse, now furnished with a well-used sofa, and look at a painting Tommy had made of a rocket ship. Grace would be in the kitchen teaching a volunteer to bake cupcakes. She had a habit of humming off-key while icing, and the house would smell like sugar and paint. He thought of how 3 days and 4 cards had once been a reckless curiosity, and how much it had cost him, and others, to learn that empathy cannot be arranged as an experiment. On the anniversary of the fundraiser that had nearly tipped St. Francis into crisis, the shelter held a small fair. The children put on a play about ordinary heroes. Oliver sat in the front row and watched Grace take a bow. Paint on her cheek, hair a little mussed, the pretty hands that mended more than fabric. After the play, as children queued for hot dogs and face paint and to reenact scenes with cardboard props, Oliver took Grace's hand and they walked into the courtyard where lanterns swung slowly in the night like low moons. "We were young to think a test could teach us what kindness is," Oliver said, voice soft. "We were young to test people," Grace replied, thumb tracing the seam of his palm. "But we learned." They stood together in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by the small, loud life they had helped sustain. The city hummed beyond the bricks, loud and indifferent, and the weight of wealth no longer defined the shape of who they wanted to be. And if you're still thinking about those 4 black cards, ask yourself which one you would hand someone, and why. Would you be tempted to test or to trust? Would you measure someone's worth by a receipt, or by the small things they choose to do when no one is watching? If this story moved you because it's about mistakes and redemption, about how power can be misused and then, if carefully rebuked, reformed, there's more where this came from. If you want to see other stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next one. And before you go, rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell us how it landed with you.